This video will demonstrate a front-end workflow for ProcessWire that is based loosely on the Sage starter theme for WordPress. Please read the Sage website to learn all about the benefits. They also have some screencasts that demonstrate how to work with Sage in depth. We'll only cover the ProcessWire portion of this. So the first thing we want to do is install ProcessWire. Let's go to the installation. So this is just a typical installation, nothing too interesting here. I'm going to use the default beginner edition profile, and we'll be making some heavy modifications to this. So we have ProcessWire installed. So let's log into the admin real quick. Okay, so ProcessWire is installed. Now let's download Sage. So from the website, go to the GitHub page, click Download Zip, and then let's unzip it. So here is the theme folder. Now what we want to do is bring in the necessary files and then make any modifications to the beginner default ProcessWire template and have it work with Sage. So let's see how to do this. Let's go into the theme folder. And you can see that we have a whole bunch of files here. Now let's walk through them one by one. These files here are just some markdown files that contain information about the program, or rather the starter theme, so we'll just leave those as is. This is the gulp file. This file here is WordPress's index archive file, so we can get rid of that. This is WordPress's page file, so we can get rid of that as well. WordPress's screenshot theme file, we don't need that. This is a single template file for WordPress's posts, so we can get rid of that. This is a style.css file, which is not needed either. Custom template there. WordPress's functions file. This file here brings in the header and footer in a way that is unique to Sage, but what we're going to do is just use head.php and foot.php files, so we can ignore that. We have a 4.4 page which we can also remove. We can remove this language folder here, and in the way that I'm doing this, I'm going to remove anything that brings in markup. So anything that's in this templates file here is going to be pretty much gutted. So we'll do that in a minute. So let's first get rid of these files that I highlighted. Okay. Now these files here are related to Bower and your configuration. I won't cover those here, but they do have some importance if you do take advantage of them. You can choose to leave them. This is our Bower JSON file, which we'll be using heavily because Sage takes advantage of a Bower-based workflow. This is our package.json file, which is used for installing the necessary modules from npm, and we'll cover that in a moment. Now let's delete that folder there, and let's go inside lib. Now most of this stuff is related to outputting markup and correcting or optimizing some of WordPress's standard markup, so we don't need any of that. The only file that's going to be somewhat important is the assets file, which we will extract the necessary functions from. So let's go ahead and gut all of these files except for assets.php. We will eventually gut this file and the folder that it belongs in. Templates, like I mentioned earlier, is something that we can also gut. It's mainly based off of outputting markup, so you can choose to replicate it or you can just use your own markup. So let me start by copying this over into our beginner templates folder. Copy that, and then inside of our ProcessWire installation, I'll go to Site, Templates. Now before I paste it, I'm going to delete all the unnecessary files that have to do with this beginner template. So errors, script styles, the README, and we'll stop there. So let's paste, and we now have our Sage files combined with our beginner template files. So the next step that we want to do is to define whether we're in development mode or production mode, which Sage uses when it comes to building assets. If we were using WordPress, we would define a variable called wp_env. env stands for environment, and we would set that to either production or to development. In ProcessWire, we can assign this variable to a configuration variable and assign the same values. So let's do that. Here's our project folder, and let's go to config.php, and let's assign an environment variable here. There we go. We will also need to assign a variable to represent the distribution directory. So let's do that now. There we go. Now let's clear out the header and footer and init file of the default beginner template, and then we'll replace it with some markup that is more friendly to the Sage way of doing things. So here's the header. Let's just clear that out. Same as footer and the init file. Now we need to add some code to the init file, which is probably the best place to do this. And what this code will do is it will load the proper paths to these JavaScript and CSS files based on whether we're in production or in development mode, and properly grab the files based on the manifest file that's generated by Sage. So that sounds like a mouthful, but here's what we have to do. So if you look at the assets.php file that we talked about earlier, there's some code that we need to adapt for a ProcessWire installation. And you can see that this code here calls in a lot of WordPress based functions, and we can't just copy that in because this isn't WordPress. And it's referring to certain directories and a distribution directory, which we made a variable for a moment ago. And so we have to adapt this code to make it ProcessWire friendly. And some of this won't be necessary, so we can leave it. But what we need to do is grab this function and this class, and then modify it accordingly. So let's go ahead and copy that. Let's paste it into our init.php file. And then we need to make the necessary modifications so that it loads the assets based off of ProcessWire's directory structure. So this should be replaced with ProcessWire's templates directory. and this should be replaced with that, and this gets the system-based path. We then need to refer to the distribution directory, so let's bring in that configuration variable, and let's replace this one as well. And we also need to replace this variable here with the one that we made earlier in the configuration file. And so that takes care of all the replacements for the init.php file. And ultimately what this code does is that it loads the CSS and JavaScript files based on the environment that we're in and based off of whether our assets have been compiled for development mode or production mode. And we'll see how that works in just a few moments. We now need to add code to our header and footer file that takes advantage of this function. So let's do that now. So I've pasted in some boilerplate code here, and really the most important line here is this one right here. And what this does is that it calls in the main CSS file, but does it using the asset path function. And like I mentioned a moment ago, that will load it correctly based off of how it was built with Gulp. So feel free to modify this to your needs, but the most important part is this line right here. And the other important thing here is that the body class should have a class that's based off of the page's name. And the reason that is because the way the main.js file works in Sage is such that it takes advantage of a certain technique that has to do with the page's name being in the body class, which we'll demonstrate in a moment. Now let's take care of the footer, which is where the JavaScript will be referenced. So I've pasted in some ready-to-go code, and what's pasted here is similar to what you saw earlier with the main CSS file, except for the JavaScript. We're using that same function again, and what these lines do are, first it loads Modernizer, and then it loads jQuery based off of the Google CDN version of it. And then the next line loads it loads jQuery only if the CDN version of jQuery failed. So that's what this line here does. And then lastly, we're loading our main.js file. So let's save that. And everything you see here is pretty much what the WordPress version does. I've just boiled it down to what you actually need to place in here without any specific markup related to the visual appearance of the website. Okay, so now that we got that in, we can probably delete our assets.php file and the lib folder that it resides in. So let's do that. All right. So now we can move on to the command line and run npm install to install the modules that are based in package.json, and then run bower install, which will install the dependencies shown here, and then we can take a look at what's been done. So in your command line, navigate to the templates directory of your ProcessWire installation and run npm install. This will take a few minutes. So npm install has been ran, and now let's run bower install to install the dependencies, which will bring in Bootstrap, jQuery, Modernizer, and so forth. So that's been done. Now let's refresh the front end of our website. There it is. Now we have a little error here because we no longer have this function. And you can also see that the appearance of this page is still unstyled, and that's because we have to run gulp to build the assets. So let's first go to our basic page.php file and add a little style to it. So here's the basic page. Now let's just cut this out and then put some very, very basic markup in here. This is Bootstrap's container, which will center the page and hit the maximum breakpoint. Let's just make a simple column structure. Okay, let's save that, and then let's refresh. Oh, this is the home.php file. I edited the basic page file. So let's just copy what I did to the home.php for the sake of speed. And there we go. So now we need to run gulp, as I mentioned before, so that the page, so that the styles come in. So let's run gulp. So it's building the styles, the JavaScript, and it's making a folder called dist, and everything gets minified, and pretty much whatever's in the gulpfile.js gets ran accordingly, and it packages everything up nice and neatly. So you can learn more about what goes on there by reading the gulp file and also visiting the Sage website. It's pretty much the same process whether you're in ProcessWire or WordPress at this point. And so now that it's been built, if we refresh the site, we're now running Bootstrap. And if we look at the backend, the source code, you can see that the main.css file is getting called in. And if we look at that file, you'll see that gulp has automatically brought in all the CSS from the various libraries and put it all in here and minified it. And we're also calling in the JavaScript files, and as you can see, it automatically found the correct path and so on. Let's, for the heck of it, bring in a Bootstrap navbar just to show that it is in fact Bootstrap. So I'll just paste in some dummy code. And there you go. So now let's run gulp with the production flag so that we have our assets generated without source maps and more conducive for a production site. So let's go to our command line again and run gulp -- production. And like I mentioned before, all of these commands are documented on the Sage website. So it's going and building all of that. And if we look at the directory structure here, you will see that we now have our main.css file, but it has a cache busting string in there. And it generated a assets.json file which tells it what the name of that unique file name is. So the code that we put in init.php earlier will go through this file and properly grab the right file if we set the site to be in production mode. So the site is still in development mode. So I refreshed, and as you saw, we're still in development mode, but I built the assets using the production flag. So it's still going to look for main.less or main.css like so, but that doesn't exist anymore because we rebuilt the assets, which deleted everything and then rebuilt it with the cache busting string. So in order to make it load the correct file name, we need to put the environment variable in production mode. So let's do that. Now let's refresh. And if we view source, you'll see that it in fact loaded the correct file. And this is really powerful, and Sage is awesome because it takes care of a lot of heavy lifting. And this is all documented on their website, but let's just demonstrate some of the coolness of it. So let's say I wanted to install Slick Carousel, which is a very popular package. It will automatically, using certain npm modules, combine everything together without having to specifically tell it to. So let's see how to do this. Let's install Slick Carousel and make sure to use -S to save it to our bower.json file. So Slick Carousel has been installed. Now we want to run gulp to build it, and it will automatically bring in the necessary JavaScript, fonts, CSS, and so forth into the main.js file and main.less file. So if we look at the fonts folder, for example, in the dist folder, which was just rebuilt from the command that I ran, you will see that the Slick font files have automatically been brought in. And this is because of how Sage is configured to handle all this automatically behind the scenes. And it's a huge time saver and just makes for a very great workflow. And if we look at the JS file here, you can see that it did bring in the stuff related to Slick. And that just makes it really nice to work with. Finally, I forgot to mention that you can run gulp space build, and it will automatically build your assets every time you save. So let's put the site back in development, and then let's run gulp watch. If I make a change to our main.less file, so I just save it, and automatically behind the scenes it's going to build the new style sheet. And so I don't have to manually run gulp every single time. And if I refresh, it's automatically taken care of. Let's just demonstrate that one more time. Save. Behind the scenes, it starts building everything. Refresh, and done.